Class, MASH. By a Nutty. Chapter 201, Return to the Sect. Their conversation had proven fruitful. MASH now understood something about himself that he didn't even know before. His presence alone affected the world around him. Since birth there had been nothing he could do to change that fact. The more he thought about his past, the more he saw the truth in Red's words. Even without thinking of the things that had affected him directly, he could remember other big events happening when he was a child. There had been that unexpected monster swarm. It was something that had caught the whole city off guard. It had lined up perfectly with imprisonment. He wondered what other things might have happened that he just didn't know about. He was probably the reason his siblings got the classes that they did. They had worked hard to get their classes, but he still felt like it might have been due to his presence. He was questioning more events of his life. How many things had he really accomplished? Stop thinking that way. It won't help with your meditation, and it is pointless. You are who you are, nothing can change that but yourself. Priscilla rarely spoke to him in a scolding manner. She did it occasionally when they were talking about lighter topics, but he wasn't expecting it for something like this. However, her words resonated with him, and he found himself refocusing on the meditation. He needed to recover his energy in order to make a portal to Daniel's world. The others were wandering around his world, looking to see if there was anything of interest. MASH realized he should probably do that at some point but decided that could be something he dealt with later. Instead, he just focused on getting his energy back in order to make another portal. MASH wanted to go to Daniel's world, to gain access to a new form of power. Hopefully, find some new powerful monsters that would give some stats and abilities. The other classes seemed a lot better than his, at least in terms of combat ability. His class had strangely provided him with utility, but his only power increase was in mixing his forms. It was a significant increase, but he couldn't help but feel like Luke's class had done more for him. The stat gain alone was ridiculous, though he thought that was intentional. The more he went over his skills, the more he believed that his class was designed to improve rapidly. He focused inward, easily able to check his status while recovering. Chimera's constitution, passive giving up your humanity has improved your body, improving your physical control, natural defenses, animalistic intuition, and mana control. No longer a human in any sense, you are no longer bound by that which limits them. You have created your own race, improving your rate of growth. The skill mentioned that it improved his rate of growth. The description was vague, and that could mean a lot of things. It could refer to his rate of leveling, his stat gains, or maybe even his affinity with magic. There were too many things that could fill that space. Once he figured out what it meant, it would hopefully let him catch up to the others. It wasn't like he was that far behind them. If anything, he would surpass them when he mixed his transformation. Especially if he mixed all of them. The stat improvement alone would make him far stronger than them. While he thought about his transformations and how to mix them effectively, he felt the others enter his domain. You done, MASH? MASH could easily hear Jill's yelling, and he responded with a shout in return. He didn't think the yelling was necessary, but he did it all the same. It felt weirdly wrong to not yell back in response. It was one of those things that people just kind of did without really thinking about it. Yet, MASH rose from the ground and held his hand out in front of him. He didn't actually need the gesture, but he had built the habit when using his magic. Wood grew from the ground as the space warped into a swirling mass of darkness. The wood rose to frame the portal, making an archway that seemed to swallow everything. Once it was done, he let the others step through first. He took one last look around, telling Priscilla to memorize it. He wanted to know how much things would change when he returned. It would help him understand how time and distance worked when he traveled outside of the world. He stepped through the portal and quickly took in his surroundings through his domain. Although in this situation his eyes were a better tool. They were in a wide open plain, short green grass spreading into the distance. The others were all staring in the same direction, and with a turn of his head, he saw what had caught their interest. The city of the setting sun was a breathtaking sight. Seeing the buildings sprawled from the ground all the way to the tip was quite showy. Most of the cities back home were designed more practically. That's where we're headed. The building at the top is the sect. It actually goes above the clouds too. MASH had told them of his experience before, but seeing the place was a different thing altogether. Everything always seemed more daunting when it pierced the clouds. They talked little as they walked toward the city. Daniel had told him that he should report to the sect when he returned and that he would try and meet them if he was around. Mash was pretty excited and tried to speed the group along. Let's go. I want to go and see if we can learn their paths. They seemed pretty impressive. None of them disagreed. Despite having just advanced, they were always eager to get new abilities. It was a byproduct of their world. The desire to grow and gain new skills was shared among everyone. By now everyone had gotten a mark from Jill, and she teleported everyone to the town directly. Since she could only really see the mountain, she had teleported them directly to the side of the mountain. The reduced mana costs made her teleports the most effective form of transportation. No real reason to have long flights, though he would probably enjoy doing some anyway. Nothing much had changed about the sect, which was a good sign. It probably meant that the invasion hadn't started yet. Jill was looking over the mountain, and Mash pointed toward the sect's entrance. However, he chose to point at the top of the staircase. He didn't really want to waste any time climbing the staircase. The world blurred around him, and before he noticed they were standing right in front of the entrance. There were large stone doors blocking his entrance. He hadn't seen these before, and he wondered why something like this was added. He didn't feel anything strange from them with his domain. What was the purpose of stone doors? It's not like they would really be able to stop anything. They walked towards it, and Luke easily pushed the stone door open. It dragged across the ground unpleasantly, however it didn't really look difficult. He didn't bother opening it all the way either, as they could easily walk through with just a small push. Several things happened when he pushed the door open. There were dozens of children in matching clothing inside. They all wore similar clothing. Some simple leather armor with a few metal plates in the most important locations. It was very similar to what he had seen before. Almost every person inside fled upon seeing them, and Mash could hear them shout in desperation. Some called for their masters, while others were yelling about monsters. A few froze, obviously terrified of the sudden intrusion. They weren't that scary, right? Mash paused looking over his group and could understand some of the fear. Mash looked mostly human, but his eyes were strange. Jill was in a similar boat, but Red and Luke were wildly different. Red's skin was a sickly grey tinge, and she had a tattoo that made it seem like she was crying tears of blood. Luke's hands looked like they were made of stone, and he had gained a presence about him. None of them tried to calm the kids down and just waited for someone to respond to the commotion. Mash had met with the masters. If one of them arrived he would be able to handle the situation. What do you think you are doing? We do not allow demonkin in the sect. A group of around 15 people was approaching, and Mash was disappointed to realize that he recognized none of them. Each of them looked to be on the older side, and most had visibly graying hair. Like the children, their clothes seemed to match with those around them, though the colors varied drastically. Their tone was not friendly, and Mash considered the implications of the man's words. The man who had spoken stood at the front of the group. He had a long beard that ended in a small braid. Another oddity was the fact that the old man had no eyebrows. It was a strange look, but Mash wasn't one to judge someone based on their appearance. However, he would judge them on their actions, and it looked like these people were looking for a fight. Mash looked to the others expecting one of them to say something, but he realized that they were all waiting for him. He should have expected that as he was the only one who had any experience with these people. Taking a long breath, Mash tried to defuse the situation. We are not demonkin, whatever that is. I'm friends with Daniel and Gerald. IW. Don't bother. Gerald would never meet with one such as you. Your lies have no place here. The leading man cut off Mash's words. His tirade grew louder, and more people were gathering as he spoke. Mash didn't know what he could do if the man wasn't willing to even listen to him. Honestly, he expected everyone to be more like Daniel, and was unsure of what to do. He didn't want to get into a pointless fight, but he wouldn't just let them do whatever they wanted either. Plus, his friends wouldn't let themselves get taken as prisoners or something. Your friends, hey. Jill's comment was unnecessary, and Mash gave her a look so that she knew it. It didn't seem very effective, and he realized that none of his friends looked particularly worried. In reality, Mash wasn't either. Even on his own, he could easily detain the people in front of him. There were a lot of ways to judge a person's strength, and he knew that none of the people before him were particularly strong. Even the leading man would only be around level 60. His domain was giving him a good way to gauge a person's strength now. That was it, just like that he had come up with a solution. The man in the front was getting louder and louder as more people joined his group. He was clearly getting overconfident, as he gained more support. All Mash needed to do to get what he wanted was shatter their fragile confidence. A demonstration of his power should get the job done. Mash couldn't help but grin a little as he imagined what he was going to do. Honestly, he knew that it probably wasn't the best idea, but he thought they deserved it. He was a little annoyed with the one-sided way the man spoke. Chapter 202, Unexpected Arrival. Mash held a hand to the sky and partially transformed into Priscilla. Her new, much darker scales grew over his hand. His affinities improved enough that he could actually feel a change within in his energy. It was easy to form a pathway for it, and he built power in his hand. Lightning thrummed from his hand, making the whole arm look like it was vibrating. The air around his hand seemed to quiver from the power, and small bolts danced between his fingers. Mash turned to look at the babbling old man. The man was a lot quieter now and was just looking at his hand. When Mash noticed the old man's eyes turned towards his own, he put his best grin on. Before the old man could even get a word out, Mash fired the lightning into the sky. He wasn't trying to make it maintain a singular shape, he wanted it to spread and paint the sky with light. It was the middle of the day, but he wanted his attack to outshine the very sun. The lightning broke apart as soon as it left its hand, spreading into hundreds of branches as it painted the sky. It almost looked like the top of a tree. An uncountable number of branches covered the air, the light making the whole world flash. An instant later came the ear-shattering thunder, and Mash noticed several people clutch their ears in pain. The shaking of the ground around them was pretty rough too, and one kid even stumbled to the ground. Mash cut off his magic at that moment, realizing that he may have taken things too far. He didn't want to hurt anyone. If anything, he was trying to do the opposite, but stopping the old man from starting a fight he couldn't win. Mash really should have practiced a little with Priscilla before doing something like that. The display had been more than he had expected, far surpassing the image he had conjured for it. At the very least, it seemed to have had the intended effect on the old man. He looked horrified, and his mouth was firmly shut. Every single person that had been looking to join the man had frozen. That may have been a little excessive. Sorry. Mash tried to apologize to the people, but none of them even flinched at his words. Their lack of reaction made him wonder if they had even heard it. He was about to try saying something else but was saved from making a fool of himself. He felt something changing within his domain and was glad to see Daniel and Gerald appear. However, they had swords drawn, obviously looking for an enemy. Mash just waved to them awkwardly. Hey! I might have done something stupid. He didn't speak with much confidence, unsure of what to say, considering what he had just done. His voice trailed off as he tried his best to come up with something. Mash and I assume those three are to be your allies. Welcome back to the sect, we have much to discuss though this location looks to be a poor place for it. Gerald spoke smoothly, and he looked perfectly calm. Almost to the point that Mash would completely believe it. However, the way he kept his sword at hand told Mash that he was worried. Even with Daniel's skill to judge people, Gerald was maintaining his vigilance. He turned and spoke to the old man, addressing him and the crowd that had grown. Boril, please take everyone present and get them back on task. These people are our allies and are quite powerful. The old man nodded, though he still seemed a little confused by the situation. Although that empty look in his eyes could have just as easily been from shock. Mash really hoped he hadn't done any serious damage to anyone. While he wanted to put on a small show, he didn't want to go overboard. Maybe, Luke could heal them later if there was any damage. Gerald turned back to face Mash and his friends, before speaking again. Follow me, we can talk in my home. With that, he took to the air. Mash could see that he was manipulating the air around him to project himself upwards. Mash briefly considered trying to replicate that but decided to just form some wings instead. There was no reason to try anything fancy at the moment. The others followed him quickly, even Daniel managing to join them. The flight was mostly a quiet one, but Luke did come around to lecture Mash. They flew beside one another, slowing slightly to let Daniel and Gerald get out of earshot. Then Luke spoke. You need to be more careful. I know that you want to use your new powers, but you can't just do things like that. What if something had been flying overhead? What if you caused something else to happen? Just stop and think for a second, and if you don't think you can do that, at least send one of us a message beforehand. Hearing Luke speak with an air of superiority was confusing. Mash would have expected this conversation from Red. Luke had never been one to confront someone so openly, and Mash couldn't help but wonder how much his class had influenced him. Even Jill seemed a little more serious now. When they had been sparring, he saw how much ferocious she was in a fight. It was like she had gained this callousness, the kind he only ever saw in retired knights. Their classes were also the strongest of the bunch. Did the strength of a class change how much it affected a person's mind? Mash kept his mouth shut on the matter, and just nodded along to Luke's words. This wasn't the time or place to have a conversation about that. Mash would bring it up later and try to help them if he could. A touch of nothingness did mention that it would help his allies as well. Maybe he could help them break free of their class's influence. Both Jill and Luke would probably benefit from it. It was a passive aura, but he still didn't know how exactly it functioned. His domain was a type of aura too, and they had full control over what he focused on with it. By the time Luke finished chastising Mash, they had arrived at Gerald's home. It wasn't really a home, but a room within the tower that Mash had been in before. It seemed like Gerald's house was actually several floors of the tower, but he only ever used a single room. Apparently, he simply didn't care that much about filling the rooms with pointless items. Mash couldn't understand that. If he had a big house, he would stuff it with things from his adventures. Gerald led him to one of the rooms. It was a large empty space with a wooden table placed in the center of the room. Pillows were laid out around the table, and Gerald walked over and sat down at one of the pillows. Daniel did the same, and also pulled out a teapot and some glasses from his storage device. Mash followed suit, sitting on one of the pillows and matching Gerald's position. He sat with his legs crossed in front of him. It felt a little awkward, but Mash managed to do it easily enough. Jill tried replicating the position too, though she crossed her legs opposite to what Gerald had done. Red didn't try to sit like them and just kneeled formally, her back stiff. Luke sat casually, sitting with his legs spread out. The gesture surprised Mash more than his words had. Did his class really affect him that much? Or was it just the time he had spent alone? Luke had said he had a lot of time to think while in the trial. Well, let me start by explaining our situation. There is some urgent information which we need to discuss. Gerald started the conversation. He didn't seem to care at all about Mash's display, which probably meant that the situation was pretty serious. They all listened patiently as Gerald went over a lot. He spoke like someone familiar with being a leader. His words carried the severity of their situation quite well. Mash was surprised by a few things. The invasion was underway, but nothing too dangerous had revealed itself yet. The other side seemed to have a degree of intelligence, and they had been mainly sending scouts through the portals. Most of the virtuous sects had allied and sent some masters to watch the portals. They made sure to either capture or kill any scouts. Mash was a little stunned at the concept. Their world's strongest people were working together and were doing the majority of the work themselves. He didn't think that would ever happen back home. No, his leaders would definitely leave the brunt of the work to adventurers, only using knights if it was necessary. None of the strongest would even move unless something that could challenge them revealed itself. This world was much more unified than Mash had initially believed. Even the sects that weren't part of the alliance had taken similar steps near their own homes. Gerald's request was the most interesting thing though. He knew that Mash had a method for speaking in any language, and he wanted him to go and investigate the other side. To try and start some peaceful negotiations. It was a good idea, but Mash wasn't sure he was the best person for the job. None of the others looked too keen on the plan either. It just wasn't something they were familiar with. They were fighters above anything else, and that wouldn't change no matter what. However, they agreed to Gerald's plan. Though they wouldn't try to form peace on their own. Instead, they would try and set up a meeting between Gerald and some leader from the other world. There were plenty of things they still needed to discuss, but the conversation was cut short as Gerald was needed for something. However, none of them felt particularly bad about that fact. Now that they were just with Daniel, they might be able to get a closer look at their paths. Daniel had suggested that very idea the last time. Jill was the one to bring up the subject, and she spoke as soon as Gerald left. Mash mentioned you guys had something called paths? Could we learn them? The eagerness in Jill's voice was matched by the expression on all of their faces. Jill had been driven since her trial, and Mash could understand why. The rest of them were just excited by the opportunity. Mash for one just wanted to learn about what was available. He just liked learning about new worlds. Power was great, but he was just curious. It was something that he had gained in pursuit of his freedom. It just felt right. He wanted to be able to share that with his friends too. You may, however, it is not something that just anyone can learn. We will have to see if we have something compatible with your strange powers. I do not know what energies are within your body. Some paths may even be harmful, but we can certainly check the archives. Daniel spoke a little formally, but Mash was just glad to speak to someone who was just genuinely nice. Mash couldn't help but feel like everyone he met was out to get him. Going back to Crawl had brought up some unwanted memories. Honestly, he still felt a little disappointed when he thought of it. He couldn't help but realize how little Red had shared prior to it, and all of the secrets she had been keeping. It wasn't that he didn't understand why she had done it, it was just that it didn't make him feel any better. He stopped his thoughts from drifting back to Crawl. Instead, he followed Daniel as he led them through the tower. Chapter 203, Life Affinity. The archives were big. Daniel's explanation had not done this place justice. Hundreds, maybe thousands of books lined the shelves of the archives. It was easily bigger than a library, and that wasn't even the most impressive sight. Some of the books were moving, while others glowed and few even made noises like they were alive. The place had wildly exceeded all of Mash's expectations, and he would be lying if he said he wasn't excited to explore the books. He almost ran off on his own, but he remembered what Daniel had said. These books were not necessarily safe. A person needed to make sure that their core was compatible with a path, then find a path that fit them. Both things needed to coincide, and he wasn't even sure if they had cores, to begin with. Mash wasn't sure about the others, but if the translation was working correctly, then he did in fact have a core. At least that was what his skill claimed to be. Mash noticed another section in the room too. He didn't remember Daniel mentioning it either. Unable to contain his curiosity, Mash asked Daniel about them. With his domain, he could glimpse inside it, and he felt several items of different shapes and sizes. All of them radiated energy, and he had an idea about what was inside. What's that room? Daniel turned to look at what Mash was pointing to. After a second of staring at Mash, he sighed and gave a response. It's a vault of soul-bound items. They are named such as they bind to a person's soul. A person can only have one of them, and not everyone can be chosen. You are free to try your luck with them, but I don't think it would work for you or her. He looked toward Jill for the final word. It looked like she was going to respond, but she held herself back as Daniel finished speaking. I can sense something already bound to your souls. You would need to remove it first. Mash considered the words and thought about what might be occupying that space for him. If Jill's was her weapon, then his was probably something similar. It is probably our bond. It is one of the soul. Priscilla's message confirmed his own idea. It didn't matter all that much to Mash. He preferred getting items for utility rather than power. Honestly, he didn't mind much. While an item like that could be nice, he much preferred trying for one of these paths. Daniel didn't let them explore just yet and pulled out a crystal of some kind. It was a large clear orb that was about the size of his head. He spoke softly, but everyone could hear him. This is an item that will measure and identify your core. It will tell us what paths are compatible with you. Mash tried snatching the item first, but Jill beat him to it. She snatched the orb, and he watched as nothing happened. The orb didn't change in the slightest. Are you sure this is the right thing? Jill asked Daniel but didn't get a response. His look was enough to tell her that much. Jill tried harder, and he could tell that she tried to use a skill. His domain let him watch as her mana entered the orb, but there still wasn't a response. It appears like you do not have a core. That is interesting considering the amount of energy you just produced. Where does your power come from? Jill started explaining what mana was, and Mash took the opportunity to snatch the crystal from her hands. He didn't care much for an explanation of mana. It was common sense, and also something that no longer applied to him. He held the orb and pushed some of his energy into it. At first, he thought it would remain as it was, but then it slowly started changing color. As Mash stared at the orb, he saw something rather horrific. It looked like something was growing within the orb. He hoped it would be a tree, but that ended up not being the case as he recognized what it was. It was flesh. Mash continued to pour his energy into the orb, and the flesh slowly warped into a misshapen life form. It didn't look human, but he could have sworn he saw it moving. Daniel moved quickly, pulling the orb out of Mash's hands. The creature that had been growing within the orb started decaying rapidly. It let out a pained yell as it died. The sound was eerily like that of a baby's cry. Mash just stared at the empty space between his hands, unwilling to face the sounds. The others looked disgusted, and Luke even doubled over. Mash wanted to vomit too, but he was just too stunned by what had happened. He tried to understand what he had just done and looked to Daniel for something. I should have stopped you as soon as I realized what was happening. I'm sorry, I got distracted by the conversation. Daniel's words only prompted Luke to ask another question. Wait, you make it sound like you expected that. It is what happens to those with affinities related to the body and life. A combination of both usually results in something along those lines. However, I have never seen a living creature successfully form. It would take an enormous amount of ki, not to mention an incredibly pure affinity to life. Even with Daniel's explanation, Mash didn't shift his gaze from his now empty hands. He spoke without lifting his head. He could still see everyone's reactions to his domain. The disgust in their faces bothered him for some reason. It felt a little like he was looking at himself. Or at least what he would be if he had no forms. That was real, wasn't it? The question escaped Mash's lips, and he saw Daniel's nod in his domain. That gesture was enough, and Mash couldn't help but remember what he had seen. The life that he had made. It had been a reflection of himself. He felt the connection that had formed. It had been eerily similar to what he felt when he made imitations of Priscilla. He felt a numbness spread through his body. He felt Jill's hand land on his shoulder. His domain let him track her movements, and he didn't have the motivation to turn his head. You need to focus on something else. Trust me when I say this, you can't let yourself dwell on it. He turned to face her, about to say some stupid retort, but the look she had stopped him. She let him see past the snark, and he could see just how much effort she was putting into staying herself. Just what had she been through in that trial? She had given them an overview, but there was clearly more to it. He nodded, accepting her words. A few slow breaths later, he managed to straighten his back. To look forward and try to move past the scene. Honestly, he wanted to talk about it, but he couldn't bring himself to bring it up with Daniel here. He pushed the memories to the side, stuffing them next to memories of Crawl. Sorry, about that. I'm fine now. What kind of paths should look at? Mash couldn't muster the same enthusiasm he had earlier. Though he was trying, he focused as Daniel pointed towards a section of the archives. He walked towards them, only listening to Daniel superficially. He couldn't really focus on the conversation but hoped that the paths would prove more enticing. The others would find something to do, even if they couldn't get a path. This section was certainly strange. Most of the books were made of animal leather. It was obvious from the covers alone. Several of them even made noises like they were alive, and he thought that one of them was even breathing. Mash reached toward one of the books. Daniel had said that he would know which path was right as soon as he saw it. The first book had thick covers made from some dark brown leather. It felt rough under his fingers, and he was surprised to realize that he couldn't open the book. He was tempted to force it, but he knew that he would probably just end up ripping it. Daniel said to not force it. Mash moved to the next book, placing the previous one back in its space. There was probably some organization on the shelves, even if he didn't know what it was. Even if he just looked at the books within this section, there were still hundreds of them to try. Several of them were just piled on the floor beside the shelf. Thus began the meticulous process of trying a book, only for it to fail. He made sure to carefully return every book, but he was slowly losing his patience. Plus, the repeated failures were weighing on his mind, and he couldn't help but think about the thing he had made. The next book he grabbed was a pure white tome. The pages were made of bone, and he hesitated slightly as he tried to open them. Something about the book told him that it was the right one. That thought horrified him as he realized what the pages were made of. The book itself was easily as big as his forearm, and the covers were made of a white bone. The pages resembled animal hide. Each page obviously belonged to a different animal. He didn't open it though and set it down. He looked over the rest of the paths before him, hoping that one would call out to him more than the one in his hand. Just when he was about to give up, something else did call out to him. He reached for it, feeling much better about this path than the previous. The book was small and was even smaller than his hand. Someone had tucked it in a corner, resting it on top of a much larger book. He probably wouldn't have noticed it if not for the connection that he felt. The book was small, and it wasn't thick either. Mash didn't think that there were even 100 pages in the book. It was definitely the smallest path he had seen thus far. The cover of this book was soft, as it was made of fur. The pages looked to be normal paper, which he was very relieved to see. It didn't feel alive either. This book was a lot simpler than the last, but he chose it without hesitation. Currently, he wanted simple. Mash carefully tried opening the book and felt relieved to see the cover turn. He finally found something that he could actually look at. With his path chosen, he walked back to Daniel. He was standing by the entranceway to the other section. He was making idle conversation with Jill, and Mash could hear them discussing the differences between mana and ki. They were talking about why Mash's energy worked, while Jill's mana had failed. Luke and Red were apparently searching through the other items. Neither of them had been successful with the orb either. They turned to him, Jill noticing his approach a little before Daniel did. He held his book up so that they both could see it. As Mash walked up, he asked Daniel about the path. What do I do next? Mash knew that Daniel had mentioned it earlier, but Mash hadn't been paying much attention at the time. Thankfully, Daniel didn't seem very bothered by the question. He gave his answer in the same stoic manner that he did whenever he explained something. Mash couldn't help but think that Daniel would be a poor teacher. He didn't seem able to infuse his explanations with emotion. Chapter 204, Path of the Blood Bond. After a short explanation from Daniel, Mash was ready to begin. It was a simple process, all things considered. It wasn't even a matter of effort or skill. That would only come in once he started moving along the path. The only thing he needed to do at the moment was give the book a drop of his blood. Before he did that though, he opened the book. Most of the pages were empty, but he could at least see the name of the path. Path of the Blood Bond. There was no other information on it, and Daniel didn't have anything to add either. Most of what was known on the paths were from previous owners of it. Most paths that the sect used commonly were well known, but Daniel had little to add about this one. He knew that it was mainly used by swordsmen, but that didn't really attest to much when describing the path. Daniel had given Mash a brief overview of what to expect. Paths usually granted people 5 skills, though secondary paths only ever gave 1. He could still progress the path even if it was secondary, but he wouldn't gain as many benefits. Daniel wasn't sure whether this path would be secondary or not. It would relate to how his core was tied to his abilities, and Mash wondered if their class worked similarly to these paths. Hearing about how secondary paths would only give him 1 ability was weird too. Daniel explained that paths weren't about the variety of techniques given but building more depth on the few skills that it granted. It was a little different from the way classes worked, but there were some similarities. All of his advancements thus far had involved improvements to his skills, and many of the benefits felt like they were related. Mash was more interested in what training the path entailed. Daniel had said that he would teach them about it after they got their paths. It would take a while and be a waste if they couldn't get one. As it turned out, he would be the only one to receive the lesson. That was for later though. He needed to get this done, and he pricked one of his fingers with a thin needle. The drop of his blood slowly formed at the edge of his finger. His blood had become a little thicker, and it dripped almost like honey as it fell onto the book. Instantly, Mash felt a change within him. It felt like something within him was breaking, but he couldn't quite understand what. Different emotions swirled as pain settled over his body. It was a slow pain, like an old ache that was resurfacing. He worried about his class and if he had broken it somehow. The fear was probably irrational, but he couldn't help but check his status in a panic. His heart was beating quickly, as the information flooded his mind. A slow breath left his lips as he realized that nothing had changed. Then the reality settled in, and he found himself speaking unintentionally. Nothing happened. He said the words for himself, but Jill and Daniel were close enough to hear. Red and Luke were still looking at the items. Mash turned a questioning gaze toward Daniel. The man was ready with a reply. There is nothing wrong. The book will have the techniques you have access to, but to see more details you will need to use this. Daniel handed Mash a glass bead. Mash recognized it. It had been what Daniel had used to display his status earlier. Honestly, Mash wasn't sure if it would work, and he didn't really know how to use it in the first place. Thankfully, Daniel seemed to realize that too as he brought out another of the beads. You just pour your energy into it. Like so. Mash could use his domain to see exactly what Daniel was doing. It wasn't really complicated. He had been able to push mana out of his body since he was a child. Mash looked at the information that was displayed though, curious to see how he would compare with this system in mind. Jill leaned over his shoulder, obviously interested in what was happening. Daniel Artwood. Age, 19. Key realm, early transcendent realm. Body realm, Saint Realm. Path, path of guiding torch. Vitality, 105. Strength, 126. Dexterity, 211. Mind, 201. Ki, 431. Mash eagerly replicated Daniel's actions. He was extremely interested in seeing how it would define his abilities. Mash pushed his energy into the bead, and he waited patiently while it presented the information. Mash Stel Lumbra. Age, 18, 15. Ki Realm, Third Monstrous Realm. Body Realm, Golden Chimeric Body. Path, Path of the Blood Bond. Vitality, 300. Strength, 250. Dexterity, 252. Mind, 221. Ki, 4070. Mash read the information and first paused upon reading his age. It listed two ages, one that would be his age in accordance with his world, and the other for this world. He wondered which world was working with better standards, but it ultimately didn't matter. He would eventually become immortal, so worrying about a year or two was pointless. Mash's eyes drifted to the realms displayed, and he realized he couldn't understand them even if he tried. He didn't bother trying to understand it on his own and turned to Daniel. The man thought, didn't look like he had noticed. He was just staring at the screen, his face frozen. The raised eyebrows and wide eyes made Mash think that something was wrong. Daniel. Mash asked the question while grabbing the path book from the ground. He wanted to look at what techniques he got, but he kept his eyes on Daniel. Daniel spoke, but the words didn't really feel like they were directed at Mash. That shouldn't be possible. Your stats, your realms. Mash could see that Daniel was distracted and waved his hands in front of the man's face. Daniel stepped back, almost tripping over his own feet. However, he did look at Mash afterward. Calm down. What happened? I literally have no idea if I should be freaking out with you or not. Mash tried to sound calm, but he was getting a little anxious too. Daniel's reaction didn't sound like one of enthusiasm. No, it felt much more like fear and panic. It was strange to be able to read people from his domain. It wasn't perfect, but it gave him a sense of the person's focus and thoughts. Daniel shook his head fervently, before speaking. No, it's nothing. However, I will need a minute to gather myself. Mash nodded. He was about to look through the book but stopped as he felt Jill appear beside him. After sparring with her a little, he was getting much better at tracking her movements through his domain. He wondered if he would eventually be able to catch her and win one of their spars. Losing got annoying fast. Let's look at your techniques while we wait. Mash rolled his eyes, as Jill spoke. It had been his plan either way, but now he felt like delaying just to be annoying. Though that thought was nothing compared to his curiosity. He wanted to see the techniques more than she did. That was the plan. Mash opened the book, slowly turning the pages to try and find writing. It had been blank before, but now he saw some new text on the page. He couldn't stop a grin from forming as he began to read. Jill read along, her head hanging just over his shoulder. The first page just contained the name of his path. Path of the Blood Bond. He didn't stop there and saw something new on the next page. It was obviously a list of his techniques and he saw many empty rows. Only the first row had anything written in it. Techniques. Blood Bond. Mash was a little disappointed when he saw the list. A single entry meant that this path was considered secondary, and he guessed that his class was occupying the primary role. His mood turned around as he flipped the page again. The technique in question was written with a lot of depth. It easily covered several pages, and he guessed that he had started further along the path than most. His lone technique looked like it already had a lot of depth. Blood Bond. Form one bond with an item, linking it to your own life. It will grow in strength as you do, its state is irrevocably tied to your own. The bond changes based on the type of item. Weapon. A bonded weapon, that shares your power. In turn, it shares its own power with the wielder. It will always come to your aid. Instant equip. Instantly summon the weapon, regardless of distance. Vampiric. Heal for 5% of all damage dealt. Can overheal up to 10% of vitality. Strength. The weapon will gain weight proportional to 2 times your strength. Sharpness. The weapon will gain sharpness proportional to 2 times your dexterity. Armor. A bonded armor is a set meant to represent and protect your life. It signifies the strength of your life. It will forever match you. Shaping. the armor automatically shapes itself to fit your body, regardless of changes. Connection, the armor's state reflects your own, its design molded by your thoughts. Physical defense, the armor's physical defense is proportional to 1.5 times your vitality. Magical defense, the armor's magical defense is proportional to 1.5 times your mind. Accessory, a tool always kept by your side, it adapts to best fit your needs. That which holds the most value to you will do so in kind. Manifestation, the accessory can change its style, regardless of size. Division, the accessory will act as a second mind. Ki growth, increases the rate at which your ki grows. Ki regen, your ki regenerates at a rate proportional to 10% of your mind per second. There was more information in the book, and Mash skimmed it briefly. It just went into further details of the path and explained some more on the skill. It didn't add anything to the skill but served to give him a better understanding of what each bond could do. Each type was accompanied by a short story describing a previous follower of the path. He wasn't interested in the weapon or the accessory, neither of them felt particularly useful. Honestly, he had been a bit disappointed by the path in general. The first story pertained to the weapon and was well written. It had been the tale of a hero, one who rose through his bond. The weapon grew along his side and ultimately granted him the ability to fight against a dragon. He had died against the beast, but the weapon had lived on, becoming a true blade for heroes, as it had been reforged by the hero's soul. It was a good story and one he enjoyed. However, the next story had a much bigger impact on him. The dark moon descended, and the world quaked beneath its power. Its descent had been foretold, but the Azure Queen had not heeded the warnings of her prophets. Never had she bowed to anyone. Now, she could do nothing, and simply stared as the endless void of the dark moon's maw slowly fell upon her kingdom. The sun could no longer warm the winds, and a chilling breeze froze the world. The oceans had begun to drown the lands, the moon's closeness stirring the water's violence. She stood at the top of her castle, gazing over the kingdom she had sworn to protect. When she had ascended the throne, the kingdom had become hers, a duty that she had been unprepared to fill. The years of her rulership were coming to an end, but she had never let ruin befall her home. When foreign kings tried to conquer her kingdom, she had acted as the walls to shield her people. When the storms threatened to claim the lives of her people, she had been the roof to withstand the winds. Now, the dark moon herself descends to claim all that belonged to the Azure Queen. Chapter 205, The Queen's Dress. The Queen would not let her kingdom fall. There was still one more thing that she could do for her kingdom, that she could give to her people. The Queen leapt from the highest point of her castle, soaring into the sky to face Dark Moon. She was the Azure Queen, and she would grant her people the same protection that she always had. Her gown was her bond, and it grew to match her intentions. The entire kingdom was turned to azure, as she wanted not to protect herself but her home. The azure silk of her sleeves billowed out over the kingdom, and she held firm against the moon's final descent. However, for all her strength and skill, she could not win against the dark moon. Slowly the queen's life drained away. Her dress tore as her body broke. All her strength, all her life did nothing more than give her people another moment. In the end, that was all she could do. Her people had been witness to the queen's struggle. They had seen the queen give her life to give them a mere moment more. They had felt the warmth of her life, as the skies were painted in her azure glow. In their final moment, all her people had but only one phrase to say to the Azure Queen. "Thank you." Mash looked down at the book. His mind swimming with the story, and he was surprised to feel that he could almost picture it within his mind. That one moment the Queen had sacrificed everything to make. Mash didn't know if he could do the same. To face such inevitable demise and fight back. Also that someone else could live for another moment. Even after reading the story, he wasn't sure if it was something he could do. The story resonated with him though, and he considered what this choice would mean for him. Honestly, the accessory was probably the most practical decision, but he didn't feel like he really needed it. With Priscilla and Hunt, he didn't really need the accessory to just repeat what he already had. Similarly, the weapon probably wouldn't be better for healing than his new skills. Even the armor was somewhat redundant, but he still felt like he was leaning towards it. If he chose to make his armor his bond, he knew that the actual armor didn't matter. The Queen had chosen a dress, and he could just as easily choose a casual outfit. According to the book, he would bond to the raw material. He would need to mold its design afterward. He considered something like metal or wood but decided that he would probably just go with cloth. Its defenses were based on his stats, and the armor's material wouldn't matter in the slightest. He doubted it would be much better than his scales, but he was interested in it for another reason too. The armor wouldn't get damaged so long as he remained undamaged. Its state would match his own life, and it would shape itself to fit any of his transformations. He knew that picking something to save himself some embarrassment was stupid, but it was just one factor. He didn't immediately choose it, and instead looked at the next story first. The accessory didn't have one. He wondered why there was a discrepancy and assumed that no one had chosen that bond. Mash opened his storage space to grab some of his clothes. He would tear them up to get the material needed for the bond. Daniel finally seemed to gather himself and yelled as he walked over. "Stop! Don't use torn-up scraps for something like that. Here, I have something much better. This is called cloud cotton and is extremely valuable." There was a weird degree of respect in Daniel's tone, and Mash could tell that he was struggling to speak like he was before. It didn't stop Mash from taking the offered cotton. The cotton literally looked like it was made of clouds, and he let his desire get the better of him. Although he did question Daniel while he grabbed it. "What's with the tone?" Daniel flinched a little at the comment but answered promptly as he had before. "Your ki far eclipses my own, not to mention that it is even greater than the Master's. I had assumed that you were in a lower realm, considering your proclaimed age, and I am sorry for how I had been speaking before." Within his domain, Mash could see Jill open her mouth. Before she could say something snarky, Mash rushed to get his words out. "No, please don't do that. I have not done anything to deserve anything like that. And can you explain why realm and ki even matter?" It wasn't that he was completely clueless, it was just that he wanted to hear it from the man himself. Mash assumed that it was like levels, but he didn't know what any of it meant. Daniel seemed to relax, though that might just be because he was doing something he was obviously familiar with. He lectured Mash and in turn Jill about the fundamentals of paths. This included a description of realms and how to grow them. Mash listened attentively, though he didn't know what he thought about it. According to Daniel, a path was improved through regular meditation. Mash wasn't sure how well the translation was working because that didn't sound particularly difficult. From what Daniel was saying, it just sounded like Mash would need to meditate regularly and he would eventually improve his realm. Daniel went into the details about how to do that exactly, and Mash was surprised to realize that he knew what to do already. The other thing he talked about was the realms in general, and Mash quickly understood that his realms were not normal. Daniel suggested that his realm might similar to those that monsters possess, especially if he considered the name literally. He didn't know much about monster realms himself but said that he would look into it for him. Apparently, there was a sect comprised of humanoid monsters, and he would attempt to gather information from them. Mash was grateful as he was completely clueless on the matter. He had done something similar back when he was a kid. It was the simple process of pushing his own energy out of his body while drawing in some from the environment around him. All he would need to do was repeat that until he felt a noticeable improvement. Daniel let him keep the glass bead so that Mash could keep track of his progress. Jill considered joining Mash, but he told her that might not be the best idea. He remembered when he had done it and developed his core. It had fundamentally changed his class path, and he didn't think she wanted that to happen. Ultimately, the decision was hers to make. All he could do was give her the relevant information. After the lecture ended, Mash got to the more important part of his path. He tried bonding with the cotton. According to the book, he would need to drop some of his blood onto the cloth while imagining the shape he wanted. Mash used one of his other outfits as a reference but included some slits on the back to adjust for his wings. He used them regularly enough that he should have included them with all of his outfits. The drop of blood fell onto the cotton, and Mash felt a significant amount of his energy drain. Then he watched in awe as the drop of blood quickly spread until it covered everything. Then the colors shifted, and before long he was left with a complete outfit. It was simple, comprising of a shirt that was a little bigger than he needed, and a set of black pants with a few extra pockets along the side. The shirt's design was complex. It had his family symbol enlarged and placed on the back. It was big enough that it covered the entire back. The rest of the shirt was white. A single black scaled snake seemed to be moving along the shirt, and Mash realized he could actually make it move, though it did use a little energy. Mash almost put on the outfit right then and there but stopped when he heard a commotion from the other room. It got him to look around and reminded him that he was not alone. Glad for the interruption, he started moving towards the room. He could see inside with his domain, but he still wanted to know the exact situation. From what he could tell, it looked like Red had found something. When he got to the room's entranceway, he could see exactly what it was. He could kind of make out what it was before, but it wasn't obvious. Now, he could see the object for it was a crown, one made of silver. It looked to be made of interwoven ropes. What looked like flowers protruded from 3 places along with the crown, their stems ending in needles that would prick a person's head. It didn't look very comfortable. Red was holding it, but she obviously looked concerned. Mash could understand, it did look rather ominous. The crown of 3 focuses. I heard that uniting with the item is painful, but you need not be so worried. The effect is straightforward. It will give you 3 flying weapons from which you can channel your techniques. I'm not sure how it would work for your skills though. Red nodded at Daniel's description, and gingerly raised the crown to her head. She paused and just stared at the item for a little bit. Then after a few seconds, she just plopped it on her head. Nobody moved as they watched what happened. The whole item seemed to squeeze into her scalp. Then 3 flower petals appeared behind her head. They were about the size of her palm, and they just floated behind her head. Mash watched as the petals slowly moved, and he could see the connection between her and the petals from within his domain. Mash didn't actually think the item was very useful until he saw blood start flowing around them. It looked like Red could use her techniques through it. That made the item a lot better. Daniel then gave them another lecture, this time focusing on soul-bound items. It was mainly for Red, but Jill also listened to it carefully. Daniel even had some exercises they could do to raise their affinity with the item. While they did that, Mash opened his storage space and stepped inside. He placed the path book and glass bead inside. Also, he took the opportunity to change into his new clothes. The clothing changed in size a little to fit him better. It didn't feel like strong armor. He had somewhat been expecting it to, but he guessed it didn't matter so long as it worked. Mash did a simple test, growing a wooden staff and smacking his own leg. He didn't feel anything from the impact. The armor was doing its job, but he decided to just treat it as some extra protection. He was excited to see what else the bond would provide him when he progressed on his path. Mash moved the black snake across the shirt, finding the energy drain to be insignificant enough that he could do it almost continuously. He liked the idea of it and just let the snake crawl around the shirt randomly. When Mash rejoined the group, he saw Red and Jill whispering to their items. It frankly made them look like psychopaths. He decided to keep his thoughts to himself and shuffled over beside Daniel. As he approached, he picked up a little of what he was saying. He was talking to Luke about his soul. Apparently, Luke had been able to take whatever item he wanted. Mash was a little surprised to hear that. Why didn't you grab something? Mash asked the question as the 2 of them took notice of him. He couldn't figure out why Luke hadn't grabbed something. It felt like he was missing out on some easy power. I didn't think any of them felt right. Also, I wasn't sure if they would work right considering. He trailed off and glanced at Daniel. While Mash trusted Daniel enough to share something like his skills, he could understand if the others weren't. Their track record for getting betrayed or attacked was fairly high. Mash hoped that Daniel was as genuine as he seemed, but Mash wouldn't spill the other secrets. Either way, Mash had something more important to ask anyway. He swung his arms across his chest as he asked. So, what do you think, how is everything looking? Chapter 206, Nights. Daniel had ended up telling them about their situation, and what he hoped that Mash would do to help them. It was clear that he had been given so many things because they wanted his help on quite a few fronts. A few portals had released creatures that had been near impossible to handle, and that had been with a whole group of masters. Mash and his group were the strongest people in the world at the moment. The items were a bribe, or at least an incentive to help, although Mash didn't think that Daniel was the kind of person to do something like that. Plus, with his skills, he should have known that Mash would help regardless of receiving anything. As far as he was concerned, he just liked Daniel. Ever since their first meeting, Mash had gained a better impression of the man. Part of that was the healing item he had offered freely, but the bigger reason was his obvious honesty. Mash wasn't the best at reading people, although his domain did help him with it a little. However, Daniel was a very straightforward person, and even Mash could see that. A gentle breeze was carried into the room from a nearby window, and he glanced out to see the starry sky above him. He had been lying in bed for a while but hadn't been able to keep his eyes shut. The bed was comfortable, and the pillows seemed to mold themselves to fit his head. Normally, he would have enjoyed the luxurious room. Mash hadn't really expected the tower to have a room like this, but even the personal baths only distracted him for a few minutes. Priscilla, how many hours has it been? He had learned to trust her sense of time. She didn't bother sending a proper message, and just gave him the information he needed. It had only been a little over an hour, but it had felt much longer. No, he wouldn't be able to go to bed. Every time he had tried, he was swarmed by too many different nightmares. First, he would see that thing he had made when he learned of what paths he could take. That creature that had been a product of his magic. It had been an abomination, life given without any stable form. Simply an amalgamation of flesh. He thought of his own body, and how it was no longer human. It wasn't really anything. He belonged to no race. That wasn't the only thing that prevented him from sleeping though. No, it was the combination of images he kept seeing. Only one thing managed to push aside the image of the creature. That was his thoughts on the stuff in Crawl. Most of which was a mix of unsure guilt. However, the guilt was not because he had killed those people. After ruminating on his thoughts, he had come to realize that his guilt was for the people beyond those guards. Even had he known of Red's actions, he still would have saved her regardless of who died for it. No, he felt guilt for the people that whom the guards were connected to. When he killed people before, it had always been out of defense, a reaction to another person's decision. He wasn't sure how to feel. He felt like the people who had died deserved it for what had happened to Red, but she had been the one to create that situation. In reality, she had been the one to take action. The guards, even Ellis, had been on the other side. They had reacted to her attack. In his mind, they would be in the right, but he just couldn't see them that way. No matter how he thought about it, he felt nothing but anger. He remembered the state that Red was in and the collar, and he couldn't feel any sympathy for them. All this worrying was pointless anyway. Even if he considered the families of the people he killed, it wasn't like he could change anything. He would never go and say anything to those people. Never meet them. He needed a distraction. Thinking about what he could do to distract himself, he found himself coming back to his new path. He pulled the glass bead out of one of his many pockets. He had gotten some extra of the realm signs, as they were called, and he felt comfortable just carrying it around. Apparently, it wasn't very expensive. He had checked his realm several times. Not really because he was expecting anything to be different, rather it had just been a distraction. However, it did give him an idea about what he could work on, and he moved to a seated position. Daniel had shown him how to fill his core and push it further to try and advance his realm. Mash didn't know how close he was to advancing, or even how far along with his realm he was. Daniel told him that their every realm was split into an early, middle, and late stage. Only after progressing through all three would he be able to advance into the next realm. That was also when his path would advance his technique. Mash was actually wearing the bonded clothes, having not really seen a need to take them off. When the technique had said that the armor's state would reflect his own, it meant more than just damage. So long as he kept his body mostly clean, the outfit too would remain clean. He had done some tests, like cutting his own arm to see if it would reflect on the shirt. It had appeared as a scratch on the shirt, a slight fraying of the fabric there. He would probably need to take more significant damage for it to be noticeable. The nicer part of the bond was that the clothes repaired themselves when he healed. However, he had learned something about the clothes that hadn't been obvious from the description. He could use his wooden creations and other magic through the clothing as if it were just another layer of skin. That fact had made him certain that he had made the correct choice with his bond. He wondered if he would ever get the opportunity to try the other bonds though. The book didn't have anything about removing the bond, but he wasn't all that worried about it. He was satisfied with it, even if just to maintain his decency. As he thought about the bond, he decided to get started on some meditation or cultivation as Daniel referred to it. Priscilla, let's try the meditation method you came up with. After seeing Daniel's method, Priscilla had actually come up with something else. She was still finishing up the details, but he thought he could at least try it. If it ended up not working, then he would just do what Daniel did. I'm confident it will work. Start your meditation, just focus on pushing your energy out. Mash nodded, knowing Priscilla would get the gesture. He started immediately, feeling like he had all those years ago. Back when he had first done this. That moment had set him on this path. He slowed his breathing, taking longer, deeper breaths as he focused on the energy in his core. His domain gave him a rough idea of where the energy was focused in his body, and he could kind of keep track of his work using it. More than any other skill, his domain was probably his most useful ability. It simply had too much versatility, that even his transformations didn't compare to. The energy in his core slowly flowed through his body, exiting as he let out a breath. He didn't let himself draw any in with his breath and just focused on pushing it out faster than it could refill. Several of Priscilla's bodies appear from Mash's neck. They were still connected to him, but they stuck out of him, making him look truly like a monster. He watched as they drew in mana. The speed that they could manage was far greater than what Mash had been doing, and he was able to observe the mana's movement as it entered his body. Priscilla was more skilled at directly manipulating mana, and she figured that she could better gather the ambient mana. She could also improve its density while doing so. It was strange, it felt like he was drinking something, though more than he could handle easily. That feeling of wanting to vomit but managing to resist the temptation and swallow. There was nothing in his mouth, but he still found himself swallowing deeply. It broke his breathing rhythm for a second, and he felt Priscilla's annoyance. He quickly fixed it and refocused on the mana in his body. Priscilla was pushing the mana further inward until it stopped pressing against something within him. He could feel it building up as if it were stuck against a wall. He received a message from Priscilla, her exertion somehow coming through it. There is something around your core preventing me from sending the mana in. Keep going, you have to get through it. I did something similar before. Mash had felt Priscilla hesitate when the mana stopped, but he knew better than that. He remembered that it took some force to get his body to accept the mana. Priscilla was trying now, to force the mana past the barrier, but it wasn't working. He was a lot stronger now than he had been as a kid, and it looked like that included the border of his core. Try thinking of it like an attack. I'll warn you if it gets bad. That was another thing that had happened in the past. It had hurt to force the mana into his body, and he expected it to be the same now. Daniel's method was supposed to be painless, but it was also supposed to be slow. Apparently, they would spend years at a realm, cultivating every night for minor improvements. Mash wasn't planning on doing something that slowly. Plus, there were obviously ways to make it faster. Daniel's own realm was proof of that. He had claimed that talent played a part in it, but Mash guessed that there was something more tangible behind the difference. If it was a matter of quantity or quality of the mana, then Priscilla's method should circumvent that. Priscilla changed the way she was pushing the mana, and he could tell that it had become more like an attack. The mana was being shaped as she drew it in. She formed it into a sharp edge, and he could feel her using her own energy to give it an extra push. He wondered if he could just use her energy, but Daniel said that it would probably be too similar. To cultivate properly, Mash would need to apply stress to his core, and that would only come by using energy his body wasn't familiar with. Ambient mana should work as it was a mixture of several different kinds already. The sharp edge of Priscilla's attack collided with the barrier, and Mash felt the first signs of pain. As she applied more pressure to it, the pain grew rapidly. Before long it had become a struggle to maintain his breathing. He contemplated stopping her. This might end up doing more damage than good, but he decided to let her keep going. He could heal any damage with Luke or his inhuman hibernation afterward. The pain was different than he remembered. It started near his abdomen and spread through his body. It almost felt like someone had forced him to swallow nails, and now they were moving through his body. Occasionally they would stab or scratch something, and he would grit his teeth as the pain spiked. He could still see Priscilla trying to push, and Mash felt something in his body quiver. It was like his whole body was shaken by something, and he decided that it had probably gone too far. He was about to stop Priscilla but then felt her blade pass the barrier. The whole barrier seemed to shatter when she did that, and pain exploded in Mash's chest. Chapter 207, Violent Cultivation. He fell forward, his breathing pattern in ruins, as he crashed to the ground. All the mana that Priscilla had been building flooded in, almost like it was being drawn into him. His body shook from the pain, as it felt like his whole body was made vulnerable. Even the smallest amount of mana that was touching him felt like it was somehow burning him, melting through his skin and bones like they weren't even there. Mash noticed the sleeves on his shirt were torn in some places and fade in others. He saw similar things across his whole outfit and worry settled in. He had been doing real damage to himself. He needed to stop and heal and made sure that Priscilla knew. Stop. The message was pointless though. It was too late, the damage was done, the mana in his body was flooding into his core now that the barrier was broken. The pain was muddling his mind, and he knew that he needed to do something to regain his focus. He considered if he had any items that could help, but knew that was not the place to look. With his most recent items, many of his useful items had become irrelevant. His healing necklace was completely worthless, and a touch of nothingness was probably better than his earring for resisting mental intrusions. His items were only useful for the utility they offered as his storage item and translation item did. Instead, he focused inwards, turning to his status to try and find something. Even as he saw his status, he felt the numbers changing. This was the first time that had ever happened. Name, Mash Stel Lumber Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 102. Health, 2109/3000. Energy, 4095/4070. Fortitude, 300. Endurance, 186. Strength, 250. Agility, 252. Intelligence, 221. Wisdom, 110. Charisma, 100. Free stats, 20. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Chimeric Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Chimeric Reconstruction, Vagabond's Path, Chimeric Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Chimera's Constitution, Wooden Body, Mimic's Avarice, A Touch of Nothingness, Golden Body. In Human Hibernation, you have stolen the techniques of mages and monks to form an artificial technique, your inhuman body morphing it to fit your corrupted nature. Hibernating will increase the rate at which your body recovers, healing most wounds. Current rate, plus 200% recovery. Chimeric Reconstruction, consume what you kill for more than just stats. Steal their flesh to repair your own. Their blood becomes yours. Your enemies are nothing more than your medicine. Mash was confused. His health was decreasing, but his energy was increasing at the same time. He was somewhat transfixed by the changing numbers, his energy was going beyond its maximum. While that might be a good sign, he needed to stop his HP from dropping. He considered trying to get to Luke but didn't think he could get himself to walk. The pain in his abdomen was grating and every movement he made was making it worse. Honestly, he didn't think he could pick himself up off the ground. He settled on focusing on new skills, trying to find something that could help him. He needed to repair what he lost, which really left him with two options. His inhuman hibernation or chimeric reconstruction was probably his only solution. He couldn't imagine himself meditating for his inhuman hibernation. That left one skill, and he spoke an apology as he reached around his neck. Sorry. The word came out through a grunt of pain, and he grabbed one of Priscilla's bodies from around his neck. He squeezed his hand into a fist, the body's head getting crushed between his fingers. Take more if you need it. Priscilla was offering herself up, but Mash didn't even know if his skill would work here. It was a test and one that might just end up ruining him. He was already regretting trying this without having someone else around. His judgment had just been wrong. He had thought that with his upgrade and skills he could handle anything and fix any damage that he did to himself. However, it wasn't the time for regret. He needed to figure this out, and he used his skill on the body in his hand. Mash watched as the body seemed to dissolve into him. Its flesh mixed with his own, but it went even further than that. Everything that was once Priscilla was slowly absorbed into his body. He felt a few things happen at that moment, one of which included the pain diminishing. It wasn't gone, but he was able to regain control of his body. Mash's body felt like it was a mess, and he didn't know if the repairs would be permanent or not. He needed to make sure and immediately started using his inhuman hibernation. If he waited and the pain returned, he would need to consume another of Priscilla's bodies. He didn't want to do that. Already he could feel some of her abilities diminish. She felt weak too, and he checked in with her while starting the meditation. Are you okay? I am fine, but will need to rest for now. Your skill claims to take only flesh, but I feel like I have lost more. Mash nodded. She had done more than enough to earn some rest. On the other hand, he needed to heal and see what kind of damage he did to himself. Healing was an interesting experience as he was able to watch his clothing repair itself. The cuts and tears among it seemed to vanish completely. When he finished, his clothes looked pristine, like he hadn't almost done some irreversible damage to himself. Mash took a slow breath, his relief washing through him as he did so. Then he checked his status again, needing to make sure that he hadn't ruined anything. Two things surprised him. He had expected there to be changes considering what he had done, but he didn't think they would be positive. Adaptable Monster Core reconstructed. Adaptable Monster Core, passive and unnatural mana core, has fundamentally altered your body. Fusion with a monster has given you access to its potential. Stamina and mana combine to become energy. Your monstrous body is better able to handle the changes to your core. You have progressed your core further, by forcing it to adapt. Now, you may only further your core by repeating the process. Current bonus, plus 75-80% efficiency. Golden body, passive. Having stolen the techniques of another world, your body evolves beyond its old limitations. However, even this transformation is incomplete. Seek out the next step and truly make this power your own. Trial of the True Body, 8/100. Mash wasn't sure if he liked the changes. Not because they weren't good, but because of what had happened. The skill had changed outside of an advancement, something that had only happened once before. The change itself also stated that he would need to do this kind of cultivation if he wanted to progress. The pain he had felt could only be described as excruciating. Now it had become the only method he had to improve his core. Honestly, he wasn't even sure if he wanted to go through that again, and he couldn't keep using Priscilla's bodies for something like that. It would make him feel like he was farming Priscilla, and that just felt wrong. The other change was to his golden body. He was closer to his true body now. He wondered if that was a byproduct of absorbing Priscilla, or if that was because of the cultivation itself. He hoped it was the previous, as it made it sound like he could improve his body by absorbing enough monsters. However, he was somewhat concerned about that skill. It had healed him, but what it had done was unnatural. Priscilla's entire body was somehow turned into something that could heal him. Her scales, organs, and eyes included. The skill left nothing. An image flashed in his mind. A creature of life and flesh with nothing else to it. No shape or purpose. A life that was created to be nothing. It felt like something inside of him fell at the thought. It was that dreaded feeling of disgust and regret. It pooled inside of him, and he let it fall further, and just let it keep going until he was able to stop thinking about it entirely. He considered trying to sleep, but he wasn't tired. His healing had washed away the fatigue too. A glance out the window told him that it was almost the morning anyway. Idly, he wondered just how long he had been writhing in pain. It had to have been hours considering the time. Mash headed out of his room. The tower was elaborate, and the stone in the halls was unblemished. It was like the tower itself pushed dirt away. Mash walked across the hall and knocked on the door across from his. Luke was in this room, and Mash wanted to get him to check his condition. He got an idea of his body from the status, but he wanted to know if he had done something to his soul. Priscilla had said that she felt like she had lost more than just her body. He wanted to see if his skill had affected her soul as well. He thought that only beastmen could have skills related to the soul directly, but he wasn't human anymore either. He might have been able to get a skill like that because he had lost his humanity. The doors here were made of some thick wood, and he heard it creak a little before it swung open. Luke was obviously not used to his new strength and the door had suffered a little for it. His friend looked oddly awake. As if the sudden interruption hadn't at all ruined his sleep. Mash had known that Luke was sleeping with his domain, and he was surprised to see him look so awake. "Hey, sorry for waking you, but can you check my soul?" Luke's face changed as he processed Mash's question. He only looked awake, it was clear that he was still shaking off the morning drowsiness. Although, Mash's question seemed to do the job. Luke's body glowed briefly, and his eyes' gaze grew more firm. He had healed himself of his fatigue. All four of them had shared the details of their skills with one another, and Mash wasn't sure how Luke was healing himself. He had probably been experimenting with his skills as well. "Why? What happened?" Luke's voice carried his concern, and Mash felt the tinge of fear in his domain. It was comforting to feel his friend's concern. It was something Mash had needed, and he hadn't even realized it. He didn't let Luke wallow in it though, and he started explaining what he had done. He didn't bother hiding anything from Luke. That wouldn't be fair to a friend whom he had asked to heal him. It would be like lying to his sister. "Are you an idiot? Why would you try something so obviously stupid? And alone?" Luke wasn't trying to keep his calm, and he yelled as he grabbed Mash's hand. Mash was able to feel as Luke's sense flowed through him. Mash could feel red, and Jill woke up. They had both sprung into battle position when Luke yelled. Jill's needle had materialized in her hand, and even Red's new weapons floated around her. Although they seemed to do that constantly. Even before Luke finished yelling, Jill had teleported out of her room and appeared beside the two of them. She looked panicked. Mash was smart enough to look away as she would be in her sleepwear. It wasn't like she was wearing anything indecent, it just wasn't done. He already felt bad about seeing them with his domain, though it wasn't something he could turn off. Everything around him would always be somewhat visible to him. Although he could adjust his focus somewhat. What happened? Were we betrayed? Mash shook his head no and was somewhat shocked by the question. He knew that their track record with meeting people wasn't great, but to think that Jill would just assume that they had been betrayed was kind of sad. Luke spoke, and Mash saw him turning his gaze in the same way he had. No. Mash just did something stupid. Again? Do we need to run? There was a strange acceptance in her tone that he could tell was genuine. That felt unfair to him, but then he considered it again. Am I really that bad? Chapter 208, New Intelligence. By the time he had explained what he had done, the morning had fully enveloped them. Daniel stopped by and was in the process of leading them to one of the portals that he had found. They had called them secluded realms, and it turned out that several powerful people had made their own. They had initially believed that all dungeons were just the private space of some long-dead master. Apparently, it had taken a while to verify much of what Mash had told them. They had eventually come around though. After a few portals had released a few creatures into their world, they could no longer refute his claim. There was a sense of urgency among them, but at the same time, Mash felt like they were taking the situation too lightly. They had sent a few individuals into the portals, although none had returned. That served to further legitimize his own claim. The portal that Mash was supposed to enter was one that they had tested earlier. Daniel didn't hide his intentions and told Mash that he was hoping that they could find the previous group. The sect wanted closure, to know whether their people had lived or died. Mash had no real problem with that. He hoped that it would be a more traditional dungeon though, as he needed to get some monster corpses. After Priscilla had woken up, he shared the changes in his status with her. She had realized instantly the solution to the change. He would just need to get some monster corpses so that he wouldn't need to rely on her bodies. She also suggested that he try and get a variety of creatures, and preferably those that could use mana. Thus, his eagerness to explore these portals had only grown. The other issue with his new technique was the pain. It made it difficult to focus and develop, and he would need a way to counter it. Priscilla had another suggestion for that as well. Priscilla herself felt little pain, and he should be able to partially transform to replicate those things. In fact, even without changing forms, he should be able to remove something like pain. It made him wonder what other feelings he could change or enhance. He had managed just changing his eyes a little to be more like the cat form. It improved his perception, but that was only one small thing. He needed to study more about the monsters he had consumed. There were plenty of forms he just didn't use or consider, but maybe he should try and come up with a list. Try and find things he could take and combine. Could he construct some kind of ideal monster that took all of the strengths and none of the weaknesses? He should ask Red about it too, as she was more knowledgeable than him about things like that. That realization made him feel a little ashamed. He should study more on things relevant to his abilities. Mash felt Daniel signal a stop, and the group descended toward a clearing on the ground. Mash hadn't been paying much attention to his surroundings, his domain would keep him safe from most surprises. They had been flying high in the sky too, even Daniel doing the same. He had received a flying blade, and he stood on it as it propelled through the air. Mash found it an interesting way to travel, though it wasn't very fast. He didn't know how far from the sect they had gotten, but he saw the dungeon portal clearly. It was at the base of a crater, the forest around it completely bare. The way the black portal swirled almost made it seem like it had swallowed the world around it. It had crashed like a comet and devoured a section of the world. Mash wondered how dungeons actually appeared. None of the dungeons he had seen had looked like they had fallen there. No, they just seemed to materialize at the location and barely disturbed their surroundings. If that was the case, then what had caused this crater? What made a dungeon appear here? Hopefully, the dungeon would provide some answers. They touched down next to the portal, a layer of newly sprouted grass breaking under their feet. The ground felt hard beneath Mash's bare feet. Even now he hadn't bothered wearing shoes or boots. Many adventurers went without shoes, usually reserving those for more formal occasions. Shoes often got in the way, making steps louder and more clunky. Adventurers would easily have high enough stats to not care about stepping on anything. The higher rank the adventurers, the less of them bothered wearing shoes. Most of Mash's abilities would just end up destroying any kind of footwear. They were met by Gerald at the portal location. He looked tired, and his Mash noticed the slight blemish of blood across one of the sleeves of his robes. His clothes were different from usual. He wore a set of robes, they looked as though they were made of woven metal, and Mash almost felt like he could make out the shape of a bent sword within the clothing. A second later the impression was gone, and the robes just looked like simple silver robes. He couldn't help but wonder if Gerald's path was similar to his own. After Gerald finished speaking with Daniel, he turned toward Mash. His gaze met his. There was a slight change in his eyes. It wasn't as if he physically changed at all, but Mash couldn't help but think that something had changed within the man's gaze. However, that too vanished, as the dangerous feeling of his robes had. Gerald gave a small nod, before turning away and darting into the sky. He did not need a tool to fly, instead, it looked as if he was simply able to push against the sky itself. The air seemed solid beneath his feet. When one reaches his realm, one is able to alter the world around them with their will. They need not even use any energy. Daniel spoke, obviously noticing how their gazes were following Gerald's movements. The words startled them from the revelry of the movement and prompted Mash to ask about his own situation. Does that mean I could do that? I am unsure, your realm is not known. I do not know if it is beyond his or not. Your key indicates that it is, but I feel your path is somehow lacking. As per usual, Daniel's response came quickly. It seemed like he always knew what question would be asked. Mash knew that Daniel had some skill that let him understand another, and he guessed that helped him preempt any questions. Do you have the key charm ready? It should function simply with a slight touch. I hope that you find my sect mates. Good luck, my friends. Daniel's words were spoken as he stepped aside. The four of them took the gesture in stride and started walking towards the portal. Jill held up the item in question, indicating that she understood. It was a strange send-off, one that none of them were familiar with. Normally, when they entered a dungeon, it was for themselves, for a promise of new power and opportunity. This was different and, in a way, more dangerous. There was no way to evaluate the difficulty of the dungeon, nor was there any concrete information about what was inside. On the trip here, Daniel had told them a little bit about what they had observed thus far. The monster that had come through before was humanoid in shape but was obviously inhuman. Scales instead of skin all along their body, yet the monster's head had been different. It had a head that was more similar to a wolf, though it had large teeth which hung out of its mouth even when closed. The description had not been pleasant, but it had given Mash an idea of what to expect. As he stepped into the portal, his domain gave him information before his other senses could. On the other side of the portal was a small army of the creatures. Dozens of them had surrounded the portal, a constant set of eyes staring directly at the portal. Mash started speaking even as the world shifted fully, and the shift caught up to each of them. Stop! He yelled the word as loud as he could, not just to stop the other creatures from attacking, but also to stop Jill from doing anything. If the creatures had planned an attack, then she would certainly be the first to react. He could imagine the carnage that would break out. Normally the travel between realms felt instant, and he knew that nothing had changed about the teleportation. Rather his mind and body were quicker now, the instantaneous process felt long and dragged out. Vision returned and he was able to get a look at the startled creatures before. To say the creatures had wolfish heads were wrong. It was much more cat-like in shape, and the sharp teeth that protruded from their mouths were hooked. They were long and sharp and reached down to their chins. They were well muscled, and their bodies were coated in scales as Mash had expected. Metal plates were layered on their body, a leathery armor lying beneath them. It was a well-developed armor, something that could only be produced by a sophisticated society. His attention though turned toward something else. Something he had never seen before. Behind those within his domain, there were many more of the creatures. They were up on a higher incline, the ground here was also like a crater, a mirror of the other side. Easily 100 of the creatures stood in a row, completely surrounding the port with a strange weapon aimed at them. It is a long metal tube with a slightly curved handle halfway down the pipe. Mash's interest was instantly increased as he was introduced to something else that he had never seen before. How do you speak our language, monster? Mash couldn't help but smile at the situation. He sometimes wished that he could know what their real words were like. Only his imagination could conjure up what their word could possibly be like. He wondered if monster had the seeming meaning that he believed, the situation made comical by the sudden irony. Mash was struggling to come up with what to say, his mind was focused on keeping himself from chuckling. Thankfully, he was not the only could understand them. We have items that allow us to communicate. We aren't here to fight if we can avoid it peacefully. We would like to speak to your people and try and establish peace. The monsters around them could hear Jill's words, even those that were up on the ridge would have no problem. Her voice was oddly carried along with the air as if the very space around her wanted it to reach all ears. It wasn't like she yelled or used any mana either. She had done something like that before too, and Mash thought that was a more godlike feat than anything Luke had done so far. Although, that might change if a fight broke out here. The strange people before him didn't look any less tense. If anything, the casual display of power from Jill seemed to heighten their fears if anything. The crowd up on the ridge started passing a quiet mumble. The distance was too far to make out the whispers. However, there was enough going around that it was made obvious. Mash could feel the start of a fight, his natural senses telling him that they wouldn't listen. It was a disappointment, and he didn't want to kill so many people. Even if he fought to capture or subdue, he knew that it wasn't likely. He remembered what he had done in the sect earlier and wondered if he would need to do it again. However, yelling from beyond the ridge silenced all of the whispers. Silence. Chapter 209, Slow Walking. Silence. The word was repeated, and the many armed creatures had seemingly frozen in place. Mash wasn't even sure if they were breathing considering how still their bodies had become. It seemed like whoever had spoken was well respected or feared. It was a bit annoying to hear the person's voice without seeing them. Mash was tempted to leap into the air to get a glimpse but decided that would probably be a mistake. In an instant, Mash saw someone appear at the top of the ridge. He didn't know if they were the speaker, but the exaggerated deference they received meant that they were probably a leader. They were nothing like other people. The being in question had skin that was black as night, and it lacked a human form completely. It had 4 spider-like legs attached to what could only be described as a spider-like abdomen. The next section of its body bent upwards, it was almost like a strange ant. Its black skin looked hard as stone or carapace. Mash barely even processed the fact that it had 4 arms, as his attention was pulled to its face. A single large eye sat in the center of their face, and their mouths opened sideways. When it spoke, Mash could see that its teeth lined the side of its mouth. It didn't have a visible nose or ears either, instead, the rest of its head was just like the smooth carapace that covered the rest of its body. As the creature walked down the slope of the crater, Mash was impressed by its balance. Its body seemed like it wouldn't be so steady, yet it moved like it didn't even notice the crater. It wore some kind of cloak poncho hybrid. It was pure white though it was covered in small marks of dirt. It hung loosely from around the creature's neck. It didn't have a normal neck, rather its head seemed like it was floating a few inches above its body. The cloak just hung loosely over its abdomen, and he wondered why it even bothered with it. Mash could tell that its whole body seemed oddly disconnected. Their parts rested against one another, but it seemed superficial. His observation of the creature had not gone unnoticed, nor had it been singular. All of his friends were inspecting the newcomer with just as much curiosity. "Traveler, the reason you are here." The creature spoke with a steady cadence, and the sounds didn't come from its mouth. It seemed to emanate from its body through a series of vibrations. It probably hadn't been who had spoken earlier, though that didn't really mean anything. The words it had spoken had been odd, but he picked up on what they had meant. He wasn't the first to understand, and Red already started to respond. "We have come from the other side to learn of what was happening here and establish peace. And if possible, to recover those that had come before." Red spoke clearly enough. The creature's head rotated to face her as she spoke. Its gaze had been focused on Luke, and Mash wondered if it had a way to gauge strength. Luke had the highest stats, and it seemed to assume that he was the leader. Mash himself was struggling to do the same with the strange creature. It didn't seem to have any mana at all, and his domain was having some trouble reading the creature. He could tell that it was kind of strong, but it also felt like he was only getting a small bit of information from it. Was it obscuring his skill? Logically, he knew that it would be possible, but he just wasn't expecting to experience it here. Especially not after his recent power-up. The creature's eye slowly turned toward Mash, and Mash was a little shocked to see that it also lacked any way to shut its eye. Its gaze lingered on him, and he felt a need to respond. He produced an awkward wave, but it just looked away. "Your people are captured. 2 dead. Peace possible, come." The creature's speech was broken like it was only saying half of what it needed. They could still understand it though. The creature's torso and head turned completely around. Its legs didn't move at all. However, once the creature had turned it just started walking like nothing was wrong. The four of them glanced at one another and nodded almost simultaneously. It looked like they had the same idea. They followed the creature, and Mash felt some of Jill's mana deplete. He saw her mark the ground beneath her feet. They had come up with relatively simple escape plans. This was the first step to it. So long as Jill marked her location, then they would be able to escape most situations. The creature climbed along the ridge without any trouble, and Mash was relieved to climb out of the crater. Even if it was with an escort of armed soldiers. He still didn't know what those weapons would do, but he wouldn't underestimate it. Even he knew better than making the same mistake again. The army around them gave them a wide berth but surrounded the four of them completely. They were obviously staying within range of their weapons, but also desperately trying to not bother the spider thing. The more Mash studied the creature before him and got the idea that it wasn't really alive. It was almost like it had been alive, but no longer possessed that moniker. It didn't quite feel like Red though, so he didn't think it was undead. It was more like it was something that shouldn't be alive but was cheating death somehow. Priscilla was similarly dumbfounded on what the creature might be. Although, she had been focusing on something else. They had a simple plan for what to do in case of uncertain situations. Essentially, they would all be keeping an eye on Jill, but Priscilla would be reading her thoughts. Her mental magic wouldn't let her know Jill's exact thoughts, but she could get an impression of it. Thus, Priscilla had constantly been monitoring her thoughts so far. If Jill got a glimpse of anything, then Priscilla would send a message to everyone. Hopefully, that would be enough to give them the jump on any unexpected situations. They walked in silence, and Mash was a bit surprised by his surroundings. It wasn't like they were wildly different from what he expected, rather it was the exact same as Daniel's world. The trees here were identical to the ones he had seen around the dungeon entrance. It was almost like this world was a twisted reflection of the previous. It had been daytime in Daniel's world, but it was nearly nightfall here. The sky was dyed in a subdued shadow, a color that could only be seen with the last bit of sunlight. The deepening shadows around him were another sign of the darkening skies. The silence was growing more uncomfortable, as the walk grew ever longer. After almost an hour of walking, the sun had fully fallen from the sky. However, nothing had risen to replace it. No moon to illuminate the forest, giving the darkness a more absolute feel. The only sound that came from anyone was the crunching of grass as they trampled over it. Occasionally a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and he was grateful for its regular rhythm. At least it would break the uncomfortable silence. The creature leading them did not show any indication of tiredness, nor did it slow in the slightest. Mash and his friends didn't have any problems either. However, that didn't hold true for the army that had surrounded them. Some of the soldiers were obviously struggling, the weight of their equipment causing some to breathe deeply. That had been very enlightening for Mash. He had known at first sight these lizard-like people weren't very strong, but he didn't realize they would be so weak. Mash knew that almost anyone at level 15 would have been able to manage what the soldiers had done without even breaking a sweat. The weather here was strange too. It had actually felt a little cooler when the sun had been up. Now a humid air had started building around them. It wasn't enough to bother him, but he could tell that the others weren't such big fans of the humidity. Jill had taken several drinks of water. Luke also seemed a little uncomfortable, but Mash felt him use some of his mana to deal with his discomfort. Red seemed uncaring, though that was probably because of her strange body. Mash was the same. His body had changed, and he found that he didn't sweat. Things like the environment around him weren't really a problem. So long as it wasn't too extreme, he didn't think that the weather would ever be able to bother him. Honestly, he could probably just stand outside in the middle of winter without even feeling cold. There were other small differences that he had noticed, but that wasn't all. His body was still changing, adapting, and becoming more efficient. One strange byproduct was that he needed to use the bathroom less frequently. Apparently, his body wasn't done evolving either. Priscilla had told him that it was still making minor improvements. She believed that his next major body evolution would come when he upgraded his body. His mind had grown unfocused, as the walk had become boring. Despite the tension in the air, he didn't really feel any of it himself. Even if an attack came, Priscilla would warn him, not to mention that he would sense it within his domain. It didn't help that Priscilla could handle most of the passive observation herself. He didn't even need to keep his eyes open. It was hard to stay tense in a situation like this. Finally, something changed though, and he was saved from his boredom. The forest broke, and he could see in front of them for the first time. In the distance, he could see lights. Multicolored and changing, they glowed bright enough to illuminate the sky around them. It was quite the sight, and he wondered why magic was wasted on something like that. While the scene with the lights was pretty, it seemed like a poor decision tactically. Then he noticed a clicking sound as if two stones had collided. A road had appeared, and the creature had started walking on it. The noise was off its feet hitting the road. Mash wondered why a road just appeared but noticed some cut trees around him. They were clearing the forest and paving a path through it. Mash was going to ask the creature about what the lights were. It was hard to tell how dark it was, but then he saw the outline in the distance. It was a city. He could make out the shadows of roofs and even a castle. And saw what had to be a wall circling the city. It looked like the wall itself had some lights on it, and they served to illuminate a large number of buildings that surrounded the walls. An outer city or district. There were few cities that had things like that in his world. With magic, a wall could be built around villages, and it would only take a day or two. Arrive. Finally, the silence was broken. The strange guide had finally spoken. Its sounds were little more than complex vibrations. It was the languages that were like this that would really showcase Eifel's genius. He wondered how many beings in existence could have done what she had done. Even had they been given the resources and time, Mash doubted that his world would have been able to make such an item. As Mash thought of Eiffel, he wondered if they should visit her again. He didn't think their people would be able to withstand his own, but he could offer them an escape. There are many worlds he could visit, and many people he could try and help. What do you mean? Is that where we are going, and what's it called? Jill asked the creature, and Mash nodded along. He was still shaking of the boredom of the trip and had let his mind wander again. He really needed to refocus and get in the right frame of mind for a fight. They were literally about to walk into an unknown city, with people that very well might try to kill them. Chapter 210, Elders. The city was strange. The buildings were all made of metal, even the houses outside of the walls had a metallic sheen to them. Their shape was all standard too. A simple square base with a triangular roof. The buildings were spaced out and organized in lines that extended out from the wall. Despite the quality of the buildings, Mash had no doubt that this was the poorer section of the city. The buildings here had signs of wear, and many of the walls possessed some dents. There was one oddity that he immediately took notice of as he looked at his surroundings. He couldn't spot any creatures that looked like their guide among the village but saw several that looked like the rest of the soldiers. He even spotted some children among the eyes. Their eyes were oddly human, though their pupils were framed by yellow, making it almost seem like an eclipse. The community here seemed to come alive with their arrival, and he had seen several windows swing open as they walked through the streets. As more people made themselves visible, Mash saw more obvious signs of poverty. The clothes that the people in this village wore were not in the best of state, and everything looked like it was a size too big. The people were also skinnier than the soldiers. Mash was going to ask about it but held his tongue as they approached the wall. The wall was smaller than he had initially assumed. It was only around 20 or 30 feet tall. A wild monster might not be smart enough to figure out a way around something like that, but any army would just be able to trample over it. He wondered what kind of dangers this world faced. He pushed the thoughts to the back of his mind for the moment. His entire focus was on the wall as it opened. The entire wall slid apart, giving them an opening to walk through. Mash noticed that all of the soldiers had stopped. They froze as soon as the wall started opening. He noticed and could feel the others become a little tenser. If this was a trap, then they were walking right into it. Although, he still wasn't worried. He still didn't feel even the slightest amount of mana. That held true even as they passed the walls, which were around 10 feet thick. He could see where the part of the wall had slid into itself. He wondered how they had managed that without any mana. There weren't any wheels he could see either. Looking at it drained away some of his caution and sparked some interest instead. A new form of power was always exciting, and he wondered if he could learn anything from it. The walls had distracted him, but he turned away from them when he felt some new people enter his domain. He turned to face them and initially thought that they were elves. They were taller than he was, though were leaner than him. Not skinny, but lean and refined. They wore some type of suit which clung to their bodies tightly. He had only ever seen clothes like that once before. Back at the New Year's party, which had comprised mostly of royals. He was more surprised by how they actually looked. He turned to face them, his eyes finally catching up with his domain. It took a second for him to understand what he was looking at. Everything about them was white, and pristine almost as if they were made of ivory. Their suits were the same color as their skin but were otherwise similar to the ones from his own world. A toothy smile was placed on all their faces. Their teeth and eyes were black, the contrast making them pop. And it turned their otherwise good-intentioned smile into something distorted. It wasn't necessarily scary, but just odd. Like something he just couldn't understand. Pure black teeth were not natural, so disturbingly wrong that he couldn't return their smiles. Instead, Mash tried focusing on their eyes and ears. Their ears were long and curved backward, ending in sharp points. They were a lot longer than the ears elves had back home. Their eyes were a little odd too, though he was somewhat used to people with strange eyes. It was a pretty common thing in his life and a very common byproduct of skills. Their eyes were all black, with no indication of an iris or pupil within them. It just seemed like an empty space and made their gaze seem distant despite one of them meeting his gaze. They had noticed his scrutiny, but they were doing the same thing in reverse. He kept walking toward them, and they did the same. His gaze went beyond them, and he stared at the city behind them. Metal structures were layered in a visibly bending pattern. They were taller than he expected, but their overall design was the same as he had seen outside. The city here was much more reserved, and he didn't notice any leaving their building to catch a glimpse of them. Although, he was more surprised by the silence. He hadn't even considered the thrum of whispers that had followed him as he strolled through the tone. The noise was almost familiar to his ears. The silence he encountered now disoriented him a little. He expected to be met by a crowd or army, not three well-dressed men. Well, he thought they were men, but it was hard to tell. They all had the same slender builds and had long hair too. Plus, they didn't have discernible curves or bulges. He was glad that he didn't need to shift his gaze to check for such things. While he could trace their body shape with his domain, he didn't like doing it. It felt like that would be creepy. It's not like it mattered either way. He realized his mind was traveling in a direction he really didn't want it to and focused his attention elsewhere. Priscilla, you focus on them. He felt a pang of irritation coming from her. She had a link to his own thoughts and emotions and had picked up on his embarrassment. Such useless concern. Their gender might be important to their strength. You would only be sensing an outline. She was right, but he still wouldn't do it. It was true that his domain wasn't really a sight, but he still didn't like the idea. Not that he hadn't been tempted before. Ultimately, he conceded to her point, but he still left the job to her. She said that she hadn't detected anything dangerous, but he already knew that. Even if he wasn't trying to focus on it, his thoughts betrayed him. His focus was naturally drawn to them, and that flowed to the next thing. He realized that they had nothing to identify them one way or the other. Their whole body was smooth and stone-like just like their strange guide. That quickly rose to the top of his list of disturbing things about the people before him. Mash almost said something out loud, his shock prompting a reaction. Jill beat him to the punch and silenced anything he might have said. That was definitely for the best. Hello, we are travelers, seeking a peaceful negotiation. I am Jill, and these are, Red, Luke, and Mash. Her voice was perfectly diplomatic, but he could feel her discomfort through his domain. He was still getting used to the changes in his domain, and he hadn't figured out how to stop reading someone's aura, life. He didn't really know exactly how it worked and decided to add it to the list of things to research later. You are never going to get around to that. Priscilla's comment was unneeded, but he couldn't disagree with her outright. His life was busy, and many slow tasks often got pushed back indefinitely. This would likely end up as something he would need to ask someone else about. Maybe his brother would be able to dig something up. The Knights would likely have some secret library or something for him to use. Mash's attention was practically forced back towards the strange people, as they spoke. Their voice was loud and high-pitched. Honestly, it was so high that it kind of hurt to hear. Welcome travelers, Jill, Red, Luke, and Mash. We are the Seravi, of the autonomous Obsidian sect. I am Elder Sirji, the two beside me are, Elder Pong, and Elder Avg. Mash repeated each word to himself, just to make sure he heard correctly. Several things stood out to him, though the first of which needed to be addressed. My name is Mash. Just Mash. Those words seemed to startle everyone. His friends were just as surprised as the elders, but the elders were quick to respond regardless. Apologies. It was Elder Sirji who spoke, but Mash shook his head in haste. He hadn't spoken for an apology. No, it's not your fault. I just wanted to make the correction now. But what do you mean by sect, I'm not sure if the translation is coming right. Mash didn't hesitate to further the discussion. He was sure that Jill and Red had their own plans for what to say, but he needed to know the truth. His domain had been able to give him an idea about the key levels of Daniel and his people. However, he got nothing from the three standing before him. They were alive. Unlike with their strange guide, there was no confusion with them. Hearing them refer to themselves as a sect did bother him. It raised his suspicion and confusion, and he wanted some clarity. Of course. A sect is essentially a community of like-minded people. Those who wish to pursue the apex of something without needing to worry about much else. A place to raise the next generation, while providing a nearly endless amount of resources to further our own research. Advancement is the greatest cause. The fervor with which the elder spoke surprised Mash. Not because of his zeal, but because it didn't fit with their appearance. Their perfectly white skin seemed unable to bend properly and match the enthusiasm behind the words. Considering everything that had been said, he wondered just how old these people were. The way the elder spoke made them sound old, though they all looked young. They even seemed younger than Mash himself, though not by much. Their version of a sect wasn't really the same thing as Daniel's either. It didn't sound like it was focused on meditation. Also, it didn't sound like it had the same rigidity either. But then Mash remembered the outer city and the state of the people there. It twisted their noble-sounding words into something else, and he felt some heat building in his chest. He didn't like the situation here, the clean and expensive state of the inner city bothered him. The urge to comment about it came to mind. He wanted to see how the elder would respond to such a confrontation but held his tongue. Don't do anything stupid. Mash froze, hearing Red from beside him. Had she read his thoughts? Was he that predictable? He had barely noticed her get closer to him and was shocked to hear the whisper. Even if they weren't particularly close to the three elders, they would have easily heard the words. What did you say? We couldn't understand you. The elder's words were expected, and Mash turned to see Red's face. He had just put her in an awkward situation but couldn't think of any way to help her. She looked calm though and replied with an oddly exact amount of awkwardness. The way she twisted the bracelet on her wrist added to her charade. Sorry, I'm still learning how to use this. I merely asked if you had somewhere we could sit down. The journey was rather long. Her lie was perfect, the act perfect. It reminded him of just how skilled she was at that. It was no wonder that he had never suspected anything when he had gone for his trial. The elder's eyes went wide, and they all bowed partially. The gestures at least were recognizable. Apologies. We should have considered that. It is hard to understand the limits of others. Follow us, we shall lead you to a more comfortable location. With those words, the situation had changed. Mash didn't have the opportunity to challenge them brazenly, nor did they carry the eager curiosity that they had held a moment ago. Red's words had been successful in moving the discussion along, completely dispelling the building tension from a moment ago.